Our second speaker, Nancy Weiss Malkiel, is Professor of History Emeritus at Princeton University and a trustee of the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation. Professor Malkiel served as Princeton's Dean of the College for more than 2 decades and was founding master of Dean Mathey College, one of Princeton's 6 residential colleges. She was the first woman hired in Princeton's history department and one of the first 3 to be appointed to the professorial ranks at the university. Professor Malkiel received her bachelor's degree from Smith College and her master's and PhD in history from Harvard University. Her honors include an honorary degree from Smith College. A scholar of 20th century American history, Malkiel's books include Whitney M. Young Jr. and the Struggle for Civil Rights and the National Urban League, 1910 to 1940. She has just published Keep the Damned Women Out, The Struggle for Coeducation, and has said that the most surprising thing she learned in the course of research for this book was that, and I quote, coeducation was not the product of organized efforts by women activists, but rather brought about by powerful men who, and I quote again, were acting not on some moral imperative or commitment to the education of women, but on straightforward self-interest. Coeducation was embraced as a means of shoring up applicant pools that were declining because many students no longer wanted to go to single-sex institutions. She has also noted that many of the men who opposed admitting women later came to change their views when their daughters and granddaughters sought admission to their now coeducational alma maters. I will confess to having thought at some point that we would solve the women in science problem at Harvard if all the science faculty males only had daughters. Because they would come up to me at meetings and say, well, my daughter. In any case, Malkiel will speak this morning on Keep the Damned Women Out, the struggle for coeducation in the Ivy League and the Seven Sisters, Oxford and Cambridge. There you are.
Good morning. Barbara's already given a little bit of my talk, so forgive me if I repeat an occasional point. My subject is the flood of decisions for coeducation at elite colleges and universities in the United States and the United Kingdom in the period 1969 to 1974. Why did so many very traditional, very conservative, very elite, very old colleges and universities decide to embark on such fundamental change? Why then? And what happened? How well did coeducation work in its early incarnations? As for the United States, coeducation happened because it was in the strategic self-interest of all-male institutions like Princeton and Yale to admit women. By the late 1960s, these schools were beginning to see their applications decline along with their yields. The high school students these schools called the best boys, yes, they called them the best boys, no longer wanted to go to all-male institutions. So the key issue was the ability to continue to attract those best boys. Harvard had begun to pull away from Princeton and Yale in this period in the competition for the best high school students. Coeducation then became the means for places like Princeton and Yale to shore up a first-rate applicant pool and enrolled student body. It was not the result of a high-minded moral commitment to opening educational opportunities to women. It was not the result of deep thinking about how to educate women. Rather, it was about what women could do for previously all-male institutions, about how women would help these schools renew their hold on the best boys. Women, in other words, played the instrumental role of improving the educational experience of men. Therefore, it is not surprising that going co-ed did not always well serve the women who were admitted to the early co-ed classes. A related point, as Barbara has forecast, The protagonists in this story are men, save for Mary Ingraham Bunting, the president of Radcliffe College. Every strategist, every decision maker, everyone leading the charge for coeducation was male. So coeducation resulted not from organized efforts by women activists, but from strategic decisions taken by powerful men. Why did coeducation happen when it did? Changes in application patterns were a trigger, but the larger context of the 1960s set the stage. The civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the student movement, the women's movement. By the end of the 1960s, colleges and universities looked quite different than they had at the beginning of the decade. The composition of student bodies began to change to include a larger number of public school students, as well as students from less advantaged families, Catholic and Jewish students, even African Americans. Admitting women followed logically. As well, men and women students demonstrated together, protested together, registered Black voters together. Not going to school together seemed increasingly outmoded. And all of this, of course, bears on why high school students changed their minds about the attractiveness of all-male schools. It would be difficult to overestimate how tough it was to make coeducation happen. There was fierce opposition from alumni, as well as significant resistance from many faculty and students. Some examples to illustrate the point. As for alumni, let's start with the title of my book, Keep the Damned Women Out. It comes from a 1970 letter from a Dartmouth alumnus, class of 29, to the chair of the Dartmouth trustees. For God's sake, for Dartmouth's sake, for everyone's sake, keep the damned women out. Or some examples from my university. One alumnus wondered, why this death wish on the part of Princeton? If women were admitted, no doubt a very fine school would emerge, he said, but Princeton University would be lost forever. Another alumnus said that coeducation would dilute Princeton's sturdy masculinity with disconcerting mini-skirted young things cavorting on its playing fields. Still another alumnus put it this way, what is all this nonsense about admitting women to Princeton? A good old-fashioned whorehouse would be considerably more efficient and much, much cheaper. As for faculty, some were supportive, some were opposed, but virtually everyone put the newly admitted women students on the spot by asking for the woman's point of view, no matter whether the course was in literature or psychology, where such a view might have been relevant, or in math or physics, where it wasn't. As for explicit insults, consider the art history professor at Dartmouth who posted slides of nudes on the screen, running his hand up and down the thighs, or the oceanography professor, also at Dartmouth, who showed pictures of sea creatures, shrimp, lobster, squid, and naked women. Or the Yale History Department chair asked to consider offering a course on the history of women, who responded that that would be like teaching the history of dogs. Students were not always much better about welcoming their female classmates. There were regular outbursts from men unaccustomed to having women in their classes. The benign version, it's a girl, it talks. Male students often told their female counterparts that they did not belong on their campuses. Dartmouth offers the most striking examples of bad behavior. Dartmouth men hung banners from their dormitory windows, no coeds, coeds go home. They shouted out numbers meant as ratings of attractiveness as women entered the dining hall, as if they were rating the quality of a dive. Fraternities delighted in drunken, degrading, dangerous behaviors and scurrilous verbal assaults on women students. My favorite Dartmouth story comes from the third year of coeducation. There was an annual intra-fraternity competition where the fraternities composed and sang original songs. And in this third year of coeducation, the winning entry was the song Our Cohogs, 10 verses of outrageously insulting sexualized attacks on women. And cohog was a highly derogatory nickname for women students. The judge of this competition was the dean of the college. And he chose Our Cohogs as the most original submission and joined fraternity members in an exuberant public rendition of the song. Let's now turn to the United Kingdom. At the University of Cambridge, Churchill, Clare, and King's colleges admitted women in 1972, and at the University of Oxford, 5 men's colleges admitted women undergraduates in 1974, Brasenose, Hartford, Jesus, St. Catherine's, and Wadham. As for why coeducation happened in the UK, the story begins with the focused scrutiny of the British university system in the 1960s. The first of 2 major reports, the report of the Committee on Higher Education, chaired by Lionel Robbins, a member of the APS, made the case for the expansion of British universities with a proposed tripling of capacity such that anyone who qualified would find a place. Less than 5% of British youth at that point were enrolled in universities, and of those, less than a quarter were women. Lord Robbins argued that a large pool of talent was being denied entry. The second report, the report of the Commission of Inquiry, chaired by Oliver Franks, argued for broader recruitment of students at Oxford, reaching beyond traditional independent boarding schools to more diverse, less elite state schools in order to accomplish what Franks called the social representation of the nation in Oxford's student body. The report argued also for growth in the size of the student population and for increasing the number of women undergraduates. There was a clear desire to expand opportunities for women to study at Cambridge and Oxford, but the women's colleges lacked capacity and resources to accomplish it. In 1963-64, women accounted for 16% of Oxford students, compared with 28% in British universities as a whole. At Cambridge, the next year, just under 10% of students were women, the lowest percentage of any university in the country. So the question of how to increase the numbers of women students was front and center on the 2 universities' agendas. A peculiarly British version of strategic advantage operated at Cambridge and Oxford. Their overwhelming prestige and power made it less likely that the best boys in the UK would opt for other already coeducational institutions. And yet there was new competition for students with the founding between 1961 and 1965 of new universities at East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Lancaster, Sussex, Warwick, and York. The new universities offered broader, more flexible, more interdisciplinary, more innovative curricula, and they emphasized new styles of learning. They also offered coeducation. By 1966-67, depending on the university, women accounted for 35 to 43% of the students. The popularity of new universities among women students helped to prompt Cambridge and Oxford to consider mixed colleges. Strategic advantage meant not losing out in the competition for highly able women students. But additional issues of strategic advantage were involved in particular colleges' decisions to go mixed. The men's colleges that were the first movers at Oxford and Cambridge tended not to be the richest or the most prestigious of their respective groups. Admitting women was seen as a way to gain advantage in the Tompkins and Norrington tables, which ranked the colleges at Cambridge and Oxford in terms of the academic achievements of their graduating students. The women's colleges stood at the top of those tables. Admitting women would move a number of the very strongest students then from the women's colleges to newly coeducational colleges, and it would likely attract more accomplished men's students who would otherwise have eschewed more middling colleges for more prestigious choices. Just as the 1960s influenced the move toward coeducation in the United States, the same was true in the United Kingdom. The women's movement, the student movement, the anti-war movement were felt powerfully in Europe, affecting expectations at Cambridge and Oxford about the ways that men and women were to be educated. As was the case in the United States, another contributing factor bearing on coeducation had to do with the diversification in the 1960s of the student bodies of the most elite single-sex institutions. Cambridge and Oxford colleges began to look to grammar schools and state schools to supplement their traditional constituency of students from schools like Eton and Harrow. As student bodies on both sides of the Atlantic became more diverse, it became increasingly anachronistic to draw the line at admitting women. All of these factors set the climate for a move to coeducation. Who drove it in the UK? The answer is the faculty. The faculty were in charge. Fellows could force a decision for coeducation even over the objection of the college head. Why were fellows of men's colleges at Cambridge and Oxford enthusiastic about coeducation? There was a generational shift in many college fellowships in the 1960s. The newly elected fellows were younger men, themselves influenced by the movements of the decade. Some of them had direct experience with coeducation, and virtually all of them were more open-minded and progressive than many of their elders. They regarded single-sex education as increasingly outmoded. Unfettered by accountability to trustees and alumni, they were in a strong position to push successfully for coeducation. There were widespread fears, nonetheless, that admitting women to men's colleges would mean the end of civilized higher education, as Cambridge and Oxford had known it. And there were many forecasts of doom. Some of my chapter titles give the flavor, and they're all taken from original sources, like dropping a hydrogen bomb in the middle of the university, a tragic break with centuries of tradition. Our crenellations crumble. We cannot keep them out. But as complicated as it was to work out plans for going mixed, women students were accepted at previously all-male colleges more readily and with fewer hiccups than in the United States. There's just no evidence of fellows and tutors treating women students as any less able and serious than men, and no evidence of the ham-handed interactions in which faculty members at American colleges and universities asked their new women students for the woman's point of view. And there's also no evidence that Oxford men treated Oxford women or Cambridge men treated Cambridge women in ways that made Princeton, Yale, and especially Dartmouth so awkward for and at times deeply inhospitable to women students. Why did the inclusion of women in these venerable male colleges go so smoothly? For all the novelty of mixed colleges at Cambridge in 1972 and at Oxford in 1974, Cambridge and Oxford had been educating women students for almost a century. Women had sat in lectures with men, very occasionally participated in tutorials with men, and engaged in routine social interactions with men who lived and studied nearby. The schools had sponsored mixed dances. Men and women had sung together, debated one another, participated in the same religious groups, and belonged to the same theater, journalism, and political clubs. Although the colleges had not been mixed, the universities had, and women and men were sufficiently accustomed to one another in a range of settings to make coeducation a less dramatic change than at single-sex schools in the United States. Moreover, the intense animus from alumni that fueled unrest over coeducation in the United States was not part of the picture in the UK. Alumni were simply a much less powerful force, in significant measure because of different funding arrangements. Annual giving had not yet become a feature of the expected support for colleges at Oxford and Cambridge, and alumni were quick to recognize that coeducation had advantages as their daughters could aspire to attend their colleges. That said, one not to overstate how easy it was to accomplish coeducation in the United Kingdom. There were plenty of contentious battles within college fellowships, and colleges that had expected to be in the vanguard had to step aside when they failed to muster the necessary two-thirds majority to change their college statutes. And while alumni were less consequential than in the United States, they needed to be reckoned with, as evidenced by the efforts made by Sir Eric Ashby at Clare College, Cambridge, and Hrothgar Habakkuk at Jesus College, Oxford, to persuade their old members to accept coeducation. Both leaders compared coeducation to the decision taken almost a century earlier to remove the requirement of celibacy for the tenure of a college fellowship. And they both explained to their old members that that decision in its own day was a monumental change, threatening and frightening in many ways to contemporaries. But it had become either it was ignored by the 1970s, or it was simply regarded as natural and beneficial. And they predicted that the same would be true of coeducation. Now, my clock says I should stop, even though it's a much longer story that could be told, so I would be more than happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Nancy. I forgot how bad it was. Conrad Harper.
Conrad Harper, New York City. Nancy, thank you for that wonderful tour. Let me ask you to do something that you didn't do for the United States in that fine talk. You instanced a couple of the UK statesmen, if I may call them, on this issue. What about the United States? To point the question more directly, I think in his time, Kingman Brewster was regarded perhaps as the greatest college president of the era, certainly with respect to civil rights issues, maybe with respect to women's issues. What's your judgment as to who was the best of the college presidents on this issue at that time?
Thank you for that question, Conrad. I know this is going to sound like an expression of chauvinism, but I think Robert Goheen and William Gordon Bowen were extraordinary in this situation. Just clear-headed, principled, careful, process-driven, analytic, careful to cultivate alumni. Oh my goodness. So I think they're the very best. Kingman Brewster is a really interesting case because he was both foresighted and innovative in lots of ways, and he was also backward-looking and explosive in others. He recognized early on that Yale really ought to consider educating women. He first embraced the prospect of persuading Vassar to move to New Haven and spent from about January of 1967 until November with the two institutions engaged in very serious study of the prospect. Vassar said no, thank you. Brewster then said, okay, Yale will establish its own coordinate college for women. And then he spent the next 10 months or so studying that possibility in a very desultory way. He then found out that Princeton was serious about coeducation because Princeton's Patterson report on the desirability and feasibility of education of women arrived in New Haven. Within 2 months, with no process, no planning, Brewster turned on a dime and persuaded the corporation and the faculty to vote for coeducation. That meant that coeducation was pretty complicated in terms of its instantiation at Yale. Brewster also was conservative in surprising ways. He said publicly in the first year of coeducation that Yale was committed to educating 1,000 male leaders. Now, when you're the president of a co-ed institution, that leaves somebody out. And he, that might not have been the most diplomatic way to proceed. He also, he got Yale to a point where they were willing to consider a student body of 60% men, 40% women. They never embraced equal access, unlike Princeton. And he described himself in a newspaper interview as a 60-40 man. And he said that when he was young, he went to a lot of dinner dances. And the dinner dances worked better when there were more men than women. His students didn't find that particularly congenial. Leave aside his positions on the Vietnam War and whether a black man could get a fair trial anywhere in the United States, which enraged his alumni. So I think Brewster is a complicated case.
Yeah.
Philip Gingrich, Ann Arbor. I have a sister who graduated from Wellesley, and I wonder if you could comment on the reciprocal question of men entering women's colleges.
Well, Vassar decided to go co-ed after it said no to Yale. That seemed like a pretty innocent step to take, relatively speaking. Stay in Poughkeepsie and let men come. It was very complicated to make coeducation happen at Vassar. The worry was, could they get enough men? Could they get enough men of high enough quality academically? And I think it's taken decades for Vassar to settle down as a fully constituted coeducational institution. Smith and Wellesley both had high-level reports in the same period recommending coeducation, and both of them backed away. And they backed away for some of the reasons that Vassar had worried about. Could they possibly attract enough men of the same quality as the women they were accustomed to educating? Wasn't there still an argument for an all-female educational institution? And both of them decided that there was such an argument. And I think if you look at the long haul, Smith and Wellesley and Barnard and Bryn Mawr are doing extremely well. And the notion that there is a positive argument in terms of women as the first-class business of the institution, as the primary interest of the faculty, women who are unfettered in their choice of majors by any gender bias, so that women are studying science and economics and math, computer science in these institutions, women who are becoming leaders for their professions and their communities. I think these women's colleges are still doing what they have always done so well, admittedly with a different population of students coming in than used to be the case.
There's a balcony, and then Claudia, and then the back.
Yes, Larry Einhorn, Indiana. Can you comment upon our military institutions with co-ed, the Citadel and the other military institutions?
You know, the major military institutions went co-ed in the middle 1970s. The Citadel and VMI were a little later. This is not territory I know well, and I ought not to attempt to persuade you that I do.
Claudia?
Yes, thanks very much, Nancy. I would like to say that we both studied the same subject from slightly different ways, and we've come to the same conclusions, so that's really good. But let's be reminded of the fact that in 1966, before all these changes occurred, although when they were being talked about, fully 95% of all students in the U.S. were in coeducational institutions already. And that was the same for women and for men. So we're talking about elite institutions, and in some sense we're being a little elite in talking about elite institutions. In the 1930s, the number was 75%. In 1897, it was 56%. So the first thing is, shouldn't we be commenting on why there was change before the elite institutions changed? That's the first thing. And the second one is that one of the largest groups of students to change were in Catholic institutions. And they changed about the same time, and sort of the Pope went along with it. And so that's sort of an interesting question as well. But I think my main question has to do with the real bulk of students in the U.S. who switched to coeducational institutions long before. And in many ways, that was the pressure that you were referring to that was on these single-sex institutions. Thanks.
Oh, you're absolutely right, of course. Coeducation was the norm at most of the state universities, many private institutions, many religious institutions.
And at Harvard and at Cornell and at Penn.
You and I have a disagreement about Harvard. Claudia says that Harvard went co-ed in 1943 because Harvard and Radcliffe women began taking classes together. I don't think so. I don't think that Harvard was co-ed in 1943. And if you look at what Polly Bunting and Nathan Pusey were trying to accomplish in the 60s, and Derek Bach and Martina Horner were jockeying about in the 1970s, I think it was a long time after that when Harvard finally got to be co-ed. Cornell, absolutely. My interest is in elite institutions. You know, the BBC said they didn't want to talk to me because I was focusing on elite institutions, but that's the story. Why do these holdouts, why do these very elite, very prestigious, very full of themselves places decide all of a sudden that they have to do something that's different? And I don't think the fact that everybody else was co-ed for such a long time, frankly, had anything to do with it, at least based on what I read in the archives. They were paying no attention to that. They thought of themselves as special and distinctive and removed and apart, and for them to change was the remarkable story from my point of view.
In the back.
It's Ruth Schwartz-Cowan from Irvington, New York. And I want to thank you, Nancy, as someone who, like you, was the first woman in a department, a history department, at the State University of Stony Brook, of New York at Stony Brook, which is a co-educational institution. I was nonetheless the first woman in the department and the only woman in the department for almost 7 years. And thank you again for reminding us that locker room talk occurred at department meetings, even in coeducational institutions. It was years before I felt comfortable in a department meeting because of the talk that went on and the pictures of undergraduates that were passed around. So it wasn't just amongst alumni, and it wasn't just in the classroom, it was everywhere in academic institutions.
I think you're absolutely right. No, I was lucky. My department behaved well most of the time. But most of my young women colleagues who later joined the faculty in some other departments had a much tougher time. And so I regard myself as unusually fortunate.
Over here.
Betty Ruth Walter, Philadelphia. And this is an accolade to your study. Did I lose it?
Nope.
And to my University of Pennsylvania, because I lived the story of which you're speaking. I was admitted as a brilliant infant to the university in 1951. And at that time, it was called coordinated education. And we were not allowed to take classes with men until our senior year. Something happened in the senior year. We were allowed to enter their rooms. I fought every battle. I was in a calculus class, a 5 women student tried to change to a man's class because of scheduling complications and was denied that by the Dean of Women. 2 weeks later, 15 men were put into our calculus section of 5 women because it was a waste of financial resources to have one man teach 5 women. My senior year at Penn, 5 women were admitted to the Wharton School. I think Penn did it early, and I think they did it because we were already there on campus, as you said, about the universities at Cambridge and Oxford. And now today, more women are in the Wharton School than men are, and we did survive that, and I think it was fairly easily done. But maybe we weren't then, and we are now with 2 women presidents, the elite schools of which you were writing about in 1951.
Thank you. You still are the elite schools of which I was writing about, I think. Even more so. You know, when I entered Harvard as a graduate student in September of 1965, I was not permitted to walk into Lamont Library, the undergraduate men's library. It admitted women only in 1967. And what we were told, and I was stupid enough not to say, this is ridiculous. What we were told was that we would disturb the young men who were studying. So, no.
On that note, we must end this session. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you.